welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of an absolutely lovely novel. I am right in the middle of it, and I am enjoying it so much. I'd love to welcome you to the show. Welcome. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Hello, Jen. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Michelle B. Slater, and I never imagined that I would write a novel. It was not in my multiple goals in life, but a novel landed in my head in 2011, and The Lunatic is set in 2011 during the Occupy Wall Street movement. And there we have our protagonist, Nell Harding, a young 28-year-old who is a rare books librarian at the New York Public Library. And she starts to experience issues with our contemporary life back in 2011, including hacking and internet surveillance, and concerns about her own attachment to her smartphone. These questions become so persnickety for her that they lead her to pose her own question to herself: is absorption possible in the great age of distraction? To answer that question, she leaves her life in a radical manner in Manhattan. She quits her very good job, which I don't recommend anyone to do, as a rare books librarian. And she goes back to her childhood home of the Berkshires, where she's inherited, quite conveniently, a cabin from her late grandfather. And she discards her smartphone, and she tries to see if she can cultivate a meaningful life on her own terms without her dratted attachment to the smartphone. And then the novel ensues.
Yes. Oh my gosh, it's so lovely. I found myself identifying so much with her quandary about tech. But before we get to the novel itself, could we talk a little bit about your career? I know that you have a PhD in comparative literature. I'm super interested in that, and your work at the Mayapple Center.
Yes, absolutely. So yes, I do. I have two masters in French and comparative literature and a PhD from Johns Hopkins, also in French and comparative literature. I've also studied and taught a lot of philosophy. I was a professor after that, and then I stopped teaching because very quickly I developed a raging yet undiagnosed case of Lyme disease, which really put me aside in a parenthesis in my life for a longer period of time than I would like to admit. And so I had started writing The Lunatic back in 2011. Lyme disease struck me without a diagnosis. And so I didn't finish writing the draft of the novel. But when I was sick, I kept telling myself the story in my head when I couldn't read and I couldn't write. And I had opened this. In addition to my work as a professor and a researcher, I also write literary criticism, which is a great joy of mine, if you can imagine that. It's a passion. I'm concluding a manuscript on Milan Kundera right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I opened a childhood dream, which was the Mayapple Center, which is an interdisciplinary center in upstate Connecticut, or rather outside of New York, in Connecticut, in the woods, an interdisciplinary center that would put artists of different disciplines together and permit them to work together in a place outside of distractions on 21st century themes like political protest, climate change. And I love to see poets working with musicians on a collaborative project, visual artists, poets, scholars. And so we've done a lot of interesting things with that. And there you have it. When I recovered from Lyme disease, very unexpectedly, the doctor said that I wouldn't. I didn't return immediately to the lunatic manuscript because I recovered in a radical way. And I felt this moral obligation to write a memoir, also not in my life's goals, about my recovery from Lyme disease. So I wrote a memoir called Starving to Heal in Siberia, My Radical Recovery from Late Stage Lyme Disease and How It Could Help Others. So I wrote that, and I'm glad that I did because I receive a lot of positive feedback from people who say that the book has helped save their lives. And then I had another memoir that's on a similar theme of a medical memoir about a dog who recovered from a disease who he was also told he would not recover from. And it permitted me to examine in a philosophical way the relationship between the animal and human. And only when I had finished these two books that I thought could help a lot of humans and a lot of animals, I opened up this document from 2011 on my laptop, and there it was, the lunatic. And once I opened it, the story was still sitting in my head, very eager to emerge, and I could not stop writing. And it just, the rest of the draft came out in 2019, and then during COVID, I furiously edited every spare minute that I could find.
That is such an interesting journey, and I'm really interested in the ways that the themes of your nonfiction have sort of, manifest in your fiction as well. Having written nonfiction and moved into writing fiction, did you feel like your nonfiction writing and perhaps your academic background too gave you advantages moving into fiction? And were there new challenges for you?
That's an I love that question. Thank you for that question. So it helped me in so ways. A couple of interviewers have asked me regarding the lunatic how I conducted my research. And as it turns out, I did not conduct any research for the lunatic because my head is replete with literary sources and references. And so in the lunatic, there are multiple literary references. And it was a joy to write about them because they they live in my mind. When I see a tree, when I see a waterfall, I think of them and they're part of me. And so to be able to write about them and share about them, it was actually just a pure joy. The challenge was that as an academic writer, sometimes my vocabulary can be rather academic. And so I didn't realize that per se. But when I started working with my editor, she was absolutely wonderful, Carrie Fry. And from time to time, she would say, Mish, this is not an academic article, or Mish, the reader is going to have to look for a dictionary. And so I learned how to write in more of a quotidian style than I had been accustomed to. And it was a challenge to write dialogue in that way because it wasn't something that I had done before. But in the end, I really enjoyed the process. And I feel that it's now when you read The Lunatic, you don't have the feeling that a professor has written a book. At least I hope that that's the case.
Oh, I totally agree. Yeah, it's really the writing is both accessible but also like really beautiful. Like like it sounds really, really lovely. Just, when I roll the words around in my head. Um,
You.
you're welcome. I'd love to ask you a little bit more about the time period in which the book is set. It's very interesting to learn that like when you started, it was contemporary and it has sort of moved into a period piece. Um, I was the same exact age as Nell, living in New York City that time in late 2011. So could you talk a little bit about Nell and evoking like New York in that time period before she heads out?
I can because although I personally do not identify with Nell or most of the characters in this novel, I too spent a great deal of time in Manhattan in 2011. And I was interested in the Occupy movement. I was interested in the politics and also just in the atmosphere and in the way that I was seeing things change as well in literary cafes as the novel opens. And I would see people in a cafe that was known to be a literary spot, and there was an absence of books, and there was an increased activity in the smartphone domain. And so I was just observing. I was observing that, and and I wanted to chart it. I felt like something really significant was happening that hadn't happened in other lifetimes in other generations. And it gave me chills, and I wanted to observe it and chart it. So I would sort of write in my journal. I would be sitting in one of these cafes myself, and I would just be charting what I was seeing in my journal.
Mm.
I was interested in that, and I was very concerned about the increase in this internet surveillance and the way that, as I do write in the novel, that people can be preyed and stalked and commodified based on their internet activity. And I felt like I wanted to chart that as a sort of cultural study, as a sort of sociological cultural study, which then became fodder for my fiction.
Mm. That's so interesting. And it was a really interesting moment in history too for like, the transitional moment I think that social media was in because it was like beginning to dominate our lives, but it didn't quite resemble yet what it has become, in a lot of ways. It was a moment I think where we were on the cusp of like becoming a bigger part of our lives, and we didn't know yet really that it was going to become the almost like hyper real space, that it would be that dominate our public sphere in that way.
Exactly. And I know I do remember at that time that I distinctly recall having heard friends say that they were just losing time into a black hole on Facebook, and they were concerned about that, but they didn't know what to do with it. And Instagram was already alive, but it was in no way the Instagram that we have today and such. And so that was it. I became very interested in that shift, and that propelled me to write The Lunatic.
Yeah, I'm interested in the interplay too between sort of the rise of social media and the surveillance culture that you're also talking about, because I think all of that social media was pitched to us as being about like connection and sharing with your friends and your network. But it's so, imperceptibly crept into like this, we're also all monitoring each other. Like Foucault would absolutely, he would write thousands of pages on this, right? Like
He foreshadowed this
yeah.
with such aptitude. It just so that's why I had to refer to the digital panopticon. I had to refer to Foucault because the correspondence is just too perfect.
Absolutely.
Yes. But as you were saying, you were in midstream there, finishing your thought.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'd love to, talk about that moment, both with the Occupy movement as well, because I was also fascinated by that happening at the time. And later, when I was getting my library degree, I wrote a paper about the library inside the Occupy camp, as it
Oh,
were.
fantastic. Oh, I'd love to read your paper.
Thank you. So I'm really curious about like how Nell's decision is not only like interacting with the things that have happened to her, like in her personal and professional life, but with this like historical movement that's happening around her, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, absolutely. I I I can say that in a way, I think that, as she's departing from New York, she's driving for one of the first times in her life past these protesters. And I think that this air in at that time, as I know you remember, and I do too, there was this air of protest this air of this is not okay, an air of I am going to take my own stand. And so I think that for the protagonist, Nell, she was affected by this. And I think that even though I don't render it explicit in the novel, I do think that I like to leave things up to the reader. And I'm very much in the camp of Roland Barthes and The Death of the Author. The work is autonomous, and then I will stand back and let it speak for itself. But that being said, she was affected by the Occupy movement and this zeitgeist of taking a stand and saying no, and so that definitely played a role. And one thing that people have asked me too, if I had a smartphone addiction and this affected I have an uncanny ability to concentrate. In fact, I burn things on the stove and then it's dark and I haven't eaten because I'm so focused. So I don't have this, but I have a horror of having that. I would not like my concentration to be diminished. But what I did notice and I haven't been on Facebook for years until recently to share news of the novel, but I did notice at the time on Facebook, I have a point, that I would send a message to a friend. I would post something about going out on a morning run. And then in the little margin on the side, I would suddenly be bombarded with ads about running. And I thought, this is uncanny. This is highly disturbing. And so that played into my own thinking on internet surveillance and how even if I'm not writing something private or anyone, a morning run is not necessarily private, but it's just that the principle of having your morning run be stalked.
Yes.
It disturbed me, and it influenced the content in the Lunatic.
100%. I'd love to talk more about Nell after she leaves. Oh, well, first, before I get to that question, I'd love to talk a little bit about Argos. Nell's relationship
Please,
with
let's talk about Argos.
so sweet. I love Argos and I love their relationship. I know that it was probably influenced in some way by, your writing of Soulmate Dog and your own experience with your pet. But I especially love the interests, all the references to, people saying that Argos and Nell shared a language and stuff like that. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Oh, I could talk about that all day long. You'll have to stop me. So, yes, Argos is very much influenced by my writing in Soulmate Dog. And I do think that if the reader enjoys this relationship between Nell and Argos, that they might enjoy Soulmate Dog. And in Soulmate Dog, I do write extensively about the nature of animal communication, which I see is a radical form of communication between two beings that are so close that they start to share almost telepathically each other's thoughts. And so I didn't want to write that out explicitly in the Lunatic. I leave it to the reader to interpret. But there are moments when the protagonist writes, or not writes, but, thinks, I could almost hear Argos say, and then the thought. And so that very close relationship is something that I explore in Soulmate Dog as a way to express that non-human animals are far more than we think that they are, far more than they have been considered in even contemporary post-humanist philosophy. And so I want to give a voice to the non-human animals in that way and privilege them and celebrate them.
Oh, I do love that. And I think it is people do like when you've had a pet for a really long time, like I have a cat who's 17 and one who's 10, and you do like share like a nervous system, like the way that any sort of two close people have a sort of really close connection in terms of how they react and vibe together. But yeah, like a unique language. Like I can understand my cat's like what one blink means and what, as compared to a different
Exactly.
blink. Yeah.
There's a shared lexicon that's private. It's like Wittgenstein talking about a private language. Although he was not talking about animal to human, I think we could make that association. And so I wanted to express that in the Lunatic, and I'm glad that you appreciated that aspect of it.
Nell's life after she moves out of the city into the country, her problems are not all immediately solved right away. She encounters some unexpected challenges, some that we might expect, but also some others that I feel like as a reader I did not expect. Could you talk a little bit about maybe like how do I phrase this? Like unplugging alone did not solve all of Nell's problems because it's sort of like after the act of unplugging, it sort of renders you passive again, like sort of waiting things to change. She needs to take like a little bit more of an active role in her life. So maybe you could talk about, her challenges that she faces after her move and how that interacts with all of your literary references too. Because I feel like you're also accessing all this literature about nature and solitude and philosophy. Could you talk about that a little bit?
I can talk about that a little bit. A couple of things. I think that I didn't immediately make this association when I was writing it, but we know in classic addiction mechanisms that once the addiction stops, the psychological source surges outwards. And so in the case of Nell, when she's no longer with the smartphone, she starts to confront some psychological material from her past that is unfinished and that she still needs to heal from. And so this time that she has away from the internet in a period of solitude with Argos, it allows her to confront this unfinished business from her adolescence in a messy way, but which she does valiantly. So that would be one challenge. And I think that in terms of the nature writing, the philosophy there, I have to say there, I was influenced by the woman who painted the painting that's featured on the cover, Euphemia Brock Slater, my late mother, who it actually does not figure into the story. In the story, there is a mother, and the mother dies, but it's not my mother, and it's actually really purely coincidental. That mother doesn't even have anything in common with my mother. But I say that because my late mother was a transcendentalist. She also homeschooled me, and she filled me with references to Thoreau. I read a lot of Thoreau and Emerson when I was a child, and they've both stayed with me, and they are two of my oldest loves. So when I think about creating a meaningful life on one's own terms, I go to them. And so they came to me as I was writing on their own.
Thank you. Yeah, it's really the issues of addiction when it comes to the technology made me think a lot about my own use of technology and social media and how with any, I think, addiction or substance use disorder, you are not so much running toward the thing that you are seeking as much as you are running away from something either inside yourself or something. And so I think that like thinking about the addiction dynamics of with Nell's journey is so interesting and her emotional journey in terms of the literature and the Thoreau of it all. I just really think it's gosh, it's such an interesting way to think through uh literature that has meant a lot to you by sort of incorporating it into like a very intertextual novel?
Yes, I think so. I think so too. I think that that worked well. That felt seamless to integrate it. And I think that's exactly it, that you're running away from something. And and we're all running away from something, but then coming back to confront what that is takes a lot of courage. And so I felt that, autonomously on her own, this protagonist grew into her own in my writing, and was able to confront those things in a way that a lot of us have a hard time doing. I know that although I didn't identify it with it so much myself, I would like to go on retreat at that time, and I would just, as a matter of principle, I would turn off my phone. I would leave it in a drawer somewhere for a couple of days and just do my retreat. But it seemed funny to me that, I would intentionally do that, that we would need to do that. So there's something that I think still deserves attention about the way that we interact with these devices today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming by the show and answering all of my, extremely wandering questions.
Fantastic questions. I love your questions. And
Thanks.
it's I have to say I'm so pleased to be invited by a librarian to speak, since librarians figure prominently in the Lunatic. And so I'm delighted that you wanted to speak with me. So thank you for having me.
You're so welcome. Just before we go, what is next for you? Do you think you'll write fiction again after this?
So as I said, I'm finishing this manuscript on Milan Kundera right now. And as it so happens, so I live in Switzerland most of the time now, and it wasn't this last summer, but the summer before, a second novel came and landed in my head. Funny how it does that. Well, I was out on a hike with my dog, and so I've outlined it. I have all of the character portraits, and it's just waiting for me to write. It's very eager to get out. So I'm going to have to get down and start writing it soon.
Excellent. Well, Godspeed on your writing. And if you ever want to come back to the show to talk about your fiction or Milan Kundera, I would love that. I read every single book he wrote in college, and I think about him all the time still.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you. I would be delighted to do that. And it's been a true pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And listeners, please check out The Lunatic. It's available now, and it will be available when you hear this, wherever books are sold. So please head to your favorite bookstore or website or library if you like. All right, it's time to close this chapter. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.